Correctional facilities, unlike people, remember with unforgiving precision, down to fractions of an inch, in the exact way a steel door meets its frame. Here, the subtle difference between truly locked and merely closed can spell the line between order and chaos. Cornelius Vasquez had spent 28 years learning to measure that difference inside Marrow County Correctional Facility, a medium-security prison built in 1971. Its original cell block wing, Block C, still in daily operation, the sliding steel door mechanisms retrofitted with electronic controls in a 1998 upgrade, but still running on the same 1971 door tracks and frame structure the building had opened with. He was 60 now, facilities maintenance supervisor, responsible for the mechanical integrity of every door, gate, and lock mechanism in a building where a malfunctioning door was never simply an inconvenience. He had learned to measure that precision from a man named Delbert Ashwood, who had kept Marrow County's doors for 25 years before him and who believed, without needing to argue the point, that the most dangerous malfunction in any correctional facility was the kind that stayed invisible until the day it truly mattered. Cornelius started at Marrow County at 32, hired as Ashwood's assistant during a period when the facility was expanding its capacity faster than its maintenance staff could comfortably keep pace with. Ashwood was 61 then, methodical and unhurried, a man who treated every door and block the way a jeweler treats a watch, understanding that small tolerances mattered enormously in mechanisms nobody was supposed to notice until something went wrong. A door either locks the same way every time, or it doesn't really lock at all. Ashwood had warned him. During Cornelius's second week, the two of them standing in the quiet corridor of Block C during a daytime lockdown check, his gaze fixed on Cornelius, imbuing the words with a weight Cornelius wouldn't fully grasp for years. Anybody can look at a door and see it's closed. Takes a feeler gauge and patience to know if it's actually seated the way it's supposed to be seated. In here, that difference isn't cosmetic. It's the whole job. Ashwood kept door alignment logs, precise measurement of how flush each cell door seated in its frame when locked, taken with feeler gauge during every quarterly security audit, a level of documentation the state never specifically required of him. He did it because he believed the door's seating consistency was the truest measure of whether it could be trusted, regardless of what any electronic sensor claimed. Cornelius remembered the first quarterly audit he shadowed, watching Ashwood run the feeler gauge along a dozen doors in sequence, murmuring each measurement to himself before writing it down. He'd asked, honestly curious, why the state's own sensor system wasn't sufficient. The board at the officer station showed green lights. Every door confirmed locked, nothing to double-check. Ashwood had finished the current door before answering, unhurried as always. A sensor only tells you what's programmed to see, Ashwood had stated with calm authority. It confirms a bolt's engagement, yes, but it was never designed to question the quality of that engagement, whether that contact truly held true every single time. That, Cornelius, is a different, more profound question, and the one that actually ensures safety within these walls. When Ashwood retired, he left Cornelius the logs, along with a piece of advice Cornelius had carried for 28 years since. Don't ever trust a green light more than your own gauge. Electronics tell you what they're built to tell you. The gauge tells you the truth. Marrow County's Block C ran along a single long corridor of 48 cells, each fitted with a sliding steel door running on a track set into the original 1971 concrete frame. The 1998 modernization had added electronic locking controls and a centralized status board at the officer station, replacing the older manual bolt system with something faster and, in theory, more reliable. But the doors themselves, their tracks, their frames, and the concrete they were anchored into remained exactly what the facility had been built with a quarter-century earlier. Cornelius knew Block C like the back of his own calloused hands. Every creak, every subtle resistance was a whispered secret. He knew precisely which east end door would stubbornly stick in humid weather, and which track hunger for grease before the season's first temperature swing. He knew the particular metallic clatter each door made sliding home, a sound so consistent across 47 of the 48 cells that any deviation registered instantly, the way a mechanic notices an engine's misfire before any gauge confirms it. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that cell 114 had never once locked with quite the same seating gap as its neighbors. It wasn't dramatic. The electronic sensor at cell 114 confirmed a lock status every single time, without exception, exactly the same as every other door in the block. Officers doing their rounds saw a green light and a closed door and had no reason to think about it twice. But Ashwood had noticed, decades earlier, that the physical seating, the actual flush contact between the door's leading edge and frame, wasn't identical closure to closure. Sometimes it seated perfectly. Sometimes it left a fraction of an inch gap the sensor never detected, because the sensor was built to confirm the bolt's engagement, not the exact position of the door itself. Ashwood's earliest entry about it, dated 1988, read, *114 door seating inconsistent again. Track cleaned, rollers replaced, alignment checked twice. Locks confirm every time on the sensor, but the physical seat isn't identical closure to closure. Something behind that frame is shifting by fractions. Watching it, *. Cornelius had read that entry during his first winter with the logs, sitting in the small maintenance shop off the facility's central corridor, and had felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Ashwood had noticed something real. Ashwood had never solved it. And Ashwood had kept measuring anyway, audit after audit, patient enough to preserve a pattern he never got to finish explaining. It was, though Cornelius couldn't have named it then, the moment the door first called to him, not as a task inherited from a retiring mentor, but as a question that would belong to him now, whether he was ready for it or not. Cornelius continued the quarterly feeler gauge checks without ever being asked to. Every audit. Cell 114's door, the same inconsistent seating. The sensor confirming lock status regardless of what the gauge actually found. In his 12th year, standing before cell 114 with a gauge cold in his hand, a new resolve hardened in Cornelius. He wouldn't just note the inconsistency the way Ashwood had. He would quantify it, chase it down to its exact edges. He began recording the exact range of seating measurements, the smallest gap he ever found, and the largest across every quarterly check, turning a habit of observation into a full-fledged personal investigation. It was the moment he stopped simply carrying Ashwood's question forward and started asking it as his own. It took him nearly a decade of that precise tracking to see what Ashwood's simple notes could only imply. The door's best-case seating remained essentially perfect, closure after closure, indistinguishable from any other cell in the block. But the worst-case seating gap was growing, a small fraction more each year, slowly enough that any single audit looked unremarkable, unmistakable once laid out across 10 years of careful feeler gauge figures. The door wasn't wearing down uniformly. It was developing a widening window of possible positions, sometimes locking exactly like its neighbors, and sometimes locking with a gap that kept getting slightly larger over time. He sat with that realization one evening in the maintenance shop. Ashwood's oldest log opened beside his own decade of range measurements, the block quiet beyond the shop door during a routine lockdown. 2 men, 1 cell door. Over 30 years of the same patient question, neither of them ever quite ready to call it solved, and neither of them ever willing to stop measuring it either. If the widening had been happening since Ashwood's first 1988 entry, something behind cell 114's frame had been quietly, patiently changing for over 3 decades. Not failing outright, never failing outright, but growing less predictable year after year in a facility where predictability was the entire point. He thought about every officer who had ever walked past that door during a head count, glancing at a green light, and moving on without a second thought, trusting the confirmation signal that had never once been wrong about what it actually measured, and had also never once been asked the deeper question Ashwood had quietly been asking with a feeler gauge for over 3 decades. He wrote a new entry beneath Ashwood's oldest one, in the same plain hand. * 10 years of range measurements confirm the seating inconsistency is not stable. The worst case gap is widening, slowly, consistently. Sensor confirms lock status every time regardless, 'cause still unknown. Continuing to measure, *. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Cornelius had a theory, in his 16th year, that the cause might simply be cumulative wherein the door's roller and track hardware, decades of daily operation, eventually introducing enough mechanical play to explain an inconsistent seat, the kind where any moving mechanism eventually showed after enough cycles. He spent the better part of summer replacing every roller and rebuilding the entire track assembly at Cell 114, calibrating the new hardware precisely against the frame, convinced he had finally found something a thorough overhaul could permanently correct. The inconsistent seating persisted afterward, unchanged, continuing its slow widening exactly as his 10-year trend predicted. The new hardware had made no measurable difference. Whatever was affecting the seat wasn't the rollers or the track. It was the frame itself and whatever was happening in the concrete behind it. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the log, in the same unembellished style Ashwood had taught him, without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Roller and track were theory, ruled out. Full hardware rebuild completed. Inconsistency unchanged and on trend. The cause is in the frame, not the door hardware. Back to unexplained. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the hardware to be the answer. Mechanical, replaceable, a summer's labor and a closed question. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere inside the original 1971 concrete, in a section of wall nobody had opened in over 50 years. The security modernization announcement arrived in his 21st year. The state approved a facility-wide upgrade replacing the 1998 electronic controls with new biometric link locking system, installed onto the same original 1971 door frames across every cell block without individually inspecting each frame's structural condition first. The project treated every frame in Block C as identical, exactly as the original construction drawings described them. Cornelius read the project brief and felt an old unease sharpen into real urgency. The new system would place his entire trust in an electronic confirmation signal, exactly as the 1998 system had. And if his theory was right, that same electronic confirmation had already been quietly misleading everyone about Cell 114's actual physical engagement for over 30 years. A more sophisticated system built on the same flawed trust wasn't a solution. It was the same problem with a newer interface. He brought Ashwood's logs, along with his own decade of range measurements, to the security systems contractor. The contractor, a capable and straightforward man named Foster Adair, reviewed Cell 114's electronic sensor calibration alongside Cornelius's data at a folding table set up in the maintenance shop. The sensor confirms lock engagement every single time without exception, Adair said, reviewing the diagnostic logs on his tablet. If the bolt weren't actually engaging, we'd see a fault reading somewhere in this history. And we don't. My honest read is that minor physical seating variation is a cosmetic mechanical issue, not a security one. As long as the sensor confirms engagement, the door is locked. The new biometric system doesn't change that logic. It just adds a layer of identity verification on top of the same lock confirmation principle. The sensor confirms engagement, Cornelius said. I'm not arguing with that. I'm telling you the physical seat isn't consistent, and that inconsistency has been getting worse for over 30 years. A sensor built to confirm bolt engagement isn't built to measure how flush that engagement actually is. Ashwood figured that distinction out in 1988. My own numbers say the range of possible outcomes has been widening every year since. Adair considered that, and to his credit, didn't dismiss it outright. I don't have another explanation for a widening trend like that, but a sensor with a clean diagnostic history doesn't give me grounds to treat one frame differently in a facility-wide installation. The project scope is upgrading the control system, not individually engineering each door frame based on a feeler gauge log. It was a reasonable position, and Cornelius didn't have a structural engineering credential to argue against it. What he had was 30 years of a pattern that had outlasted a full hardware rebuild, and a growing conviction that a clean sensor history and an actually reliable physical seat were not the same thing, no matter how confidently the diagnostic log claimed otherwise. The weeks that followed were a blur of restless nights for Cornelius, haunted by Adair's logical dismissal. What if, after all these decades, his meticulous measurements were nothing more than an elaborate, professional delusion, a cosmetic quirk mistaken for a looming disaster? He had wanted, for years, for the widening gap to mean something that actually mattered to the facility's safety. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually mattering. He pulled Ashwood's oldest log out one more evening and reread the 1988 entry under the maintenance shop's single desk lamp. Something behind that frame is shifting by fractions. Watching it, Ashwood had never known the cause either. He had simply kept measuring, audit after audit, trusting that the pattern was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Cornelius had inherited that trust without ever fully testing whether it could stand against a clean sense of diagnostic and a reasonable contractor's project scope. He didn't have the cause confirmed, but not having it hadn't stopped Ashwood from writing the first entry in 1988, and it wasn't a reason for Cornelius to stop pushing now. Not with a new biometric system about to place the same electronic trust in a frame his own decade of numbers, so it was still quietly changing. With the looming threat of the new biometric system installing flawed trust permanently into the wall, Cornelius made his final, bold move. At his own initiative, he formally requested a single day with a structural engineer before the biometric installation reached Block C. Not to delay progress, he made clear, but to finally uncover the truth hidden within cell 114's frame before the new system locked its truss into place for another quarter century. The engineer was a woman named Priya Anand, who assessed older institutional structures for hidden modifications and structural anomalies. She reviewed the facility's 1971 construction drawings alongside a set of 1979 renovation records she located in the state's archive, cross-referencing them against Cornelius's decade of seating measurements, and she brought precision displacement sensors to monitor the frame's actual movement over the course of a full week, capturing normal daily thermal and structural cycling. What she found explained over 30 years of a pattern that nobody had ever been able to name. There's a renovation notation from 1979 referencing a small structural repair somewhere in this block, Priya said, showing Cornelius the archive record at a table set up in the corridor. The specifics didn't survive. The crude structural notes from that decade were lost in a records consolidation years later. But the sensor data tells the rest of the story. This particular frame's anchor points connect to a section of wall with noticeably different flex characteristics than the frames around it. Whatever was done here in 1979 left this one section of wall behaving differently than the reinforced concrete surrounding it. Different how? Cornelius asked. Under the daily assault of stress, temperature shifts, the slow settling of the building, the constant structural load, this specific section of wall flexes, infinitesimally, but critically, more than it should. Priya explained, pointing to the data, that subtle movement transmits directly into the door frame, sometimes just enough to allow full electronic lock confirmation, even as a physical bolt engages only partially. The sensor isn't wrong about what it measures. It's just never been built to measure whether the frame itself was still exactly where it's supposed to be. Priya's findings went to the State Modernization Committee within the week. Foster Adair reviewed her full report personally and called Cornelius afterward. "You were right to push for this," Adair said. The sensor was telling the truth about bolt engagement every single time. It just had no way to know the frame underneath. It wasn't behaving like every other frame in the block. If we installed a new biometric system on this same frame without finding this, we had built a more sophisticated confirmation system on top of an unreliable physical foundation. The exact same blind spot, just harder to notice because the new system would have looked even more trustworthy. The installation plan was revised. The section of wall behind cell 114 was properly reinforced to match the flex characteristics of the surrounding structure before any new locking hardware was installed. The rest of the facility-wide modernization proceeded afterward, its electronic confirmation systems finally resting on frames that behaved consistently enough to actually deserve that trust. Marrow County filed a formal note in its facility's archive, crediting both Delbert Ashwood's original 1988 observation and Cornelius's 28 years of continued measurement as the reason a hidden structural inconsistency had been found and corrected before a more sophisticated locking system placed even greater unwarranted trust in an unreliable frame. Cornelius kept Ashwood's logs. He added a final entry beneath the oldest one before moving the whole collection into the facility's permanent archive. Wall behind cell 114 reinforced this year. Flex inconsistency traced to an undocumented 1979 structural repair, measured formally through door seating variation since 1988. First audit on record with seating consistent to every other cell in the block. Delbert, you were right. A green light could never truly represent a true seat. For decades, neither of us fully understood why that crucial difference existed. But our persistence finally revealed the truth. ensuring genuine safety where superficial signals once reigned. He checked cell 114's door himself during the next quarterly audit. Feeler gauge in hand, the seating gap identical to its neighbors for the first time in the facility's recorded history. He thought about Ashwood, standing in the same corridor decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire never to trust a green light more than his own gauge, because electronics only tell you what they're built to tell you. Cornelius had carried that sentence through 28 years, through a ruled-out hardware theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of careful measurement had amounted to anything more than professional caution taken further than it needed to go. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep measuring, the way Ashwood had taught him, until the frame finally admitted exactly what had been quietly shifting behind it for over 30 years.